So I think we're going to rearrange this theme a little bit and maybe take on a few of the themes and issues that we talked about in the earlier sessions. You were all on the innovation track, so you kind of know what you talked about. I don't think you need a big summary. Take some of the themes that we heard about in the last session and maybe take them a little further for about half an hour. Anything that needs to be raised that hasn't been raised. And just by way of introduction, I'm realizing you have no idea who the hell I am. I'm Katrine Verklas. I run an organization called Mobile Active, which is an intermediary organization that tracks trends and tools and applications and all sorts of things in the mobile space across the social sector all over the world. And we do actually a big conference this year together with UNICEF in Thailand. Last year was in South Africa, that focuses exclusively on mobile technology for social good and social impact and social change. And development, if I must use that word. So Steve is one of the rapporteurs who was assigned to do a little bit of a summary. So maybe you can just remind people prior to the break, kind of some of the key themes. And then we're going to crowdsource this. So you're going to come into this very quickly.
Yeah, this is on. So in terms of the three presentations that were given, the first one, my one, focused on enabling access to participation, and essentially looking at development as a very participatory exercise and moving away from the mindset that we are the gatekeepers of information and we provide access to information which we hold, but also recognizing the value of information that's sitting on the ground with people that we can use in aggregate or that people can use between themselves. So that was one theme. Clay spoke about 5 patterns of communication that one could use for developmental purposes. And those were about enabling conversations between people, broadcasting information, which happens a lot, but then also multicasting information. So getting information from one place to another, not through steps of intermediaries, which takes time and uses resources, but one, kind of a cast your net wide, one shout out that reaching a number of people at the same time. Very much about convening conversations, again, between people and between the kind of development practitioners and kind of constituents on the ground, but also between constituents and allowing conversations to happen on the ground. And we play more an enabling role than a kind of organizational role. He also spoke about aggregating information, and that's also a role that we could play. Not just, again, not just kind of moving information from us to them, but using information in aggregate, providing the analysis, and then feeding that back. And then lastly, Grant Cambridge spoke about, he spoke about some of the realities of on the ground, especially in Africa. And he was the kind of the sober voice of kind of how bad it can be. And for many people, some of the villages that they've worked in, there were 5,000 people in a village, 2 had heard of a computer. So very much about ICT solutions needing to often play to the lowest common denominator if you're going to reach rural populations in Africa or in developing countries. Real practical issues about the extreme heat, cold, the dust, vandalism, theft, etc. Things that poverty-related issues. And he spoke about the project that he works on, which is Digital Doorway. So that's a very ruggedized IT tool, I guess, or kind of infrastructure unit that has 3 PCs connected to it. You can drop it down in a community. And it's got tons of preloaded open source and open content material on there. And how the impact that's had on communities, the powerful impact of how it's empowered communities. He mentioned the example of in rural schools where the teacher is the only person who has knowledge in that community, that the kids rely on that teacher, and if you've got a bad teacher, well, they will get a bad education. Through the digital doorway, they can actually show up the teacher and say, well, they can look up information in the Wikipedia, the preloaded Wikipedia, and say, well, actually, it works like this, not like that. And so it's actually raising the challenge to the teachers to actually kind of up their game. So what is interesting is that the digital doorway is not connected to the internet. It's just a standalone system, and they've tried to connect in certain instances. It had some effects that they weren't happy with. It changed the dynamic of the user group from kind of a spread of users from young to old to the kind of 14 to 18-year-old boys using it. So they've gone for not connected, just use the content that's there, and through webcams and through various kind of funky ways to allow interactivity and kind of creativity and playfulness with that system. So those are really the three themes: the participation, the kind of conversations, aggregating, convening, and then the kind of ruggedized ICT solutions.
So, curious, responses, other themes that you saw, even in your smaller group conversations. And feel free to sort of participate in the conversation, because we're making this up here to some extent. So I'm actually curious, because there's a couple of other themes that I heard, but I don't want to take moderator privilege here, to sort of stuff that came out of your small group conversations that struck you. Maybe something that you didn't know that surprised you. Come on. I know it's the end of the day. And yes, microphones are still floating around, same idea.
I was in the transmedia group that came up with a solution for using radio, so you had a kind of a call-in show. And I think what struck me was that it was local knowledge. It wasn't knowledge like from a book or a Wikipedia that we would bring to the local community, but that idea was post-conflict trying to get farming started again. And so you had two kinds of knowledge that might come out. One is kind of just redeveloping a knowledge about farming techniques and what works, but the other kind of knowledge was a transient knowledge. So maybe like the weather conditions are changing or something's changing, and so there's a knowledge that's local, that's of immediate use, but maybe it's not of much use a week later. So that was interesting for me.
I think, Steve, you called it latent knowledge, right? I actually like the local knowledge. Ian? I feel like I should turn around here.
Yeah, I think that, just thinking it through a bit, I think there may also have been a bit of a, sort of maybe a bit too much faith in sort of the value, maybe not too much faith, but there seemed to be a lot of sort of just inherent trust that participation is a good thing, without a lot of thought into sort of the participation for what and why. And I do feel like more people participating, giving people a voice is good, but I think there's also sort of an if you build it, they will come fallacy out there, where we believe that of course they're going to want to be able to connect to each other, of course they're going to want to share information. I think being a bit more deliberate in what's the value here, and how do we make sure we're not imposing the sorts of cultural connections that we are familiar with, and the sorts of wanting to question your government, and wanting to participate in this new bill, and wanting to connect to people in the next village over, that maybe we aren't assuming a little too much as far as what the motivations are.
I was actually struck by the group that was looking at they didn't call it hacking, what they call it? Making, thank you. The making. It's sort of a different take, but is there an assumption that we all have that A, technology is good, that it's useful, that we bring it, there will be uptake, not taking into consideration some of the local knowledge? And I think some of the ideas that sort of floated around struck me as possibly not very user-centric, let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. So it seems to me that as development professionals, maybe we need to rethink some of the approaches. Actually, can I call on you? Patty just did a participatory design event, and I'm just curious, so if you can speak a little bit to sort of how bottom-up development around solutions that takes into consideration knowledge, expertise, local, the lowest common denominator or the ruggedization that we often don't do. We sort of waltz in there, parachute, as the case may be. So I'm just curious sort of what kind of methodology you used where, and again, this is totally moderator privilege because I know this woman. Stand up.
So what we're doing in Ghana is